This is the cover to Eric Larson's most recent book, titled Isaac Storm. The book explores the hurricane that smashed into the Texas coastal town of Galveston in 1900, killing as many as 8,000 people in what is still America's deadliest natural disaster. This event lasts about 45 minutes.
It is my great pleasure today to introduce to you Mr. Eric Larson. You may or may not know that he has been a contributor to a number of fine magazines: Time Magazine, Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, The Wall Street Journal. He's also the author of a number of fine books: Lethal Passage, The Naked Consumer. But he's here today to talk about Eric Storm, and it's a phenomenal book. I had the pleasure of reading it in Galley, picked it up and had trouble putting it down. It's an enormously compelling book. And as you know, it's about the 1900 hurricane in Galveston, which devastated the city. It is not only the state's deadliest natural disaster, but it is also the country's. So 100 years later, almost, we are still suffering. Can you not hear? All right. I'm not in control of the volume, so if somebody will turn this up. Sorry about that. Do you know which room you're in? Eric Larson, right?
I have no control over their system.
Okay, well, we don't seem to have much. You'll have to bear with us. Eric, talk loud, all right? Now, there's a special guest that I want to introduce as well, because traveling with Mr. Larson is his daughter, Lauren. Lauren, stand up. There we go. Lauren is taking credit for Eric's next book, which will be about the Klondike Gold Rush. So we'll let him, she says. All right. Let me tell you that Eric is going to do a brief reading. He will be open to questions. I would ask you, because we are being televised, that when you ask the question, stand up and raise your hand. Eric will recognize you, but wait until we have a chance to bring the microphone to you, if you would. All right? Eric Larson.
I'm going to try and talk as loudly as I can. Does this work at all? Can you hear me now? All right, so I'm going to kind of lean over and do the best I can. I am soft-spoken, so I apologize if you can't hear me. First of all, it's really nice to come and talk to a crowd that kind of fills out the room, because it's not always that way on a book tour. I know that intimately. I think any other writers in the room know that as well, except maybe Scott Churro, but I don't think he's here. A friend of mine came up with what I think is the perfect writer's definition of hell. He turned up at a bookstore for a talk one night, and there were 25 chairs in the room, and he expected a really good turnout. He expected to fill all those chairs and have people standing. 8 o'clock, time of the talk came around, and nobody had come, not a soul. He waited a little longer, about 10 after, finally, one woman arrived. She sat way in the far corner. Now, he's a pretty game guy, and he thought, okay, I'm here. He said to her, look, you know, why don't you come on down to the front row? I'm ready to talk. We'll have a conversation. And she said, well, I might want to leave early. So that's what touring is like, I'm here to tell you. Does that work? Oh, that's his. Anyway, well, first of all, let me just give you a brief rundown on what this book is about, what I think it's about. Yes, it's about the Galveston hurricane of 1900, but more than that, it uses the hurricane to open a window on a time that I think is kind of a magical time, the year 1900, the last turning of the centuries. I got into this book by accident, accident being an author's best friend. At least that's been my experience. I had actually started working on a book about a murder that occurred in 1900 that I had hoped would shed light on that period, and that was the murder of William Marsh Rice, a guy whose name is probably pretty familiar to many here. It was Rice, or at least his money, that founded or funded the starting of Rice University. But in 1900, William Marsh Rice was living in New York. Now, I promise you there's a connection to the hurricane, so bear with me. In 1900, William Marsh Rice was living in New York. He was a Gilded Age millionaire. He had a valet, and into their lives came an unscrupulous attorney from Houston. Okay? Into their lives came an unscrupulous attorney from Houston, and this attorney and the valet plotted to kill William Marsh Rice, and then fake his will and take all his money. Along came a hurricane. Now, at the time, all I knew was that this was a hurricane. Like most people who don't live in Texas, I didn't know anything about the Galveston hurricane. And let me tell you that most people who don't live in Texas really do not know or did not know a thing about it. But along came a hurricane and destroyed a lot of William Marsh Rice's interests in the Houston-Galveston area. He became very depressed, and he was about to send all his money down to the Galveston-Houston area, which, of course, for the plotters, that would not have been a very good thing. So they stepped up their plot within 24 or 48 hours, killed William Marsh Rice, so making that hurricane probably the first and last hurricane in history to be directly implicated in a first-degree homicide. But the more I mean, I was having trouble with this murder because the murder would have had to take place in the first third of the book. And I don't know, you know, the old Columbo movies could pull that off, but that's not my kind of book. And so, you know, I was struggling with the murder, meanwhile becoming more and more captivated by this hurricane. I mean, you know, one day I was in the Library of Congress, and I turned a page, a metaphoric page in the microfiche, and there was the front page of the New York Journal. And this was talking about something like 3,000 to 5,000 dead in Galveston. Now, I assumed that was an exaggeration. I thought, okay, this is the yellow press at its best in the year 1900. Turned out to be an underestimate. The best estimate of the death toll in Galveston alone for this storm was 8,000 people. For the area as a whole, probably up to about 12,000. So, you know, I was instantly hooked. I mean, I grew up on Long Island at the northern cusp of the hurricane belt, and it seemed to me every summer on Long Island, it seemed to me that there was a hurricane or a near miss from a hurricane. In fact, there was one year when a hurricane passed right over my town, and I can remember my sisters and I going out and playing in the eye before the second part of the storm came back. My dad was not out playing with us. He had put up about 100 sheets of plywood and was not at all pleased. But so I was, as a child, I was absolutely captivated by hurricanes. And so here is the mother of all hurricanes, and you know, I fell in love with it. But there was a problem. I did not want to do a disaster book. I wanted this book to have what I refer to as emotional traction. Now, you can read a lot of books about disasters, and you find them very compelling, but sometimes there's something missing. It's like if you read Walter Lord's A Night to Remember about the sinking of the Titanic, very compelling, but there's the emotional attachment to the book, the emotional power of the book is somewhat diminished by sort of an endless sequence of episodes and anecdotes. Contrast that with the movie Titanic, which, while fiction with an underlay of really very accurate fact, Titanic, the movie, I felt was very powerful. It had lots of emotional traction. You know, watching that movie with Lauren, my daughter, and having her for the first time in my life, actually watching her as she burst out in tears while watching a movie, I was very impressed. I thought, yeah, this has got a certain amount of power. So I resolved that I wanted to have a story that had power, that would tell the emotional story, the emotional life of a hurricane. But I had a number of other challenges before I even got to thinking about that. One was, you know, how do you find out where a hurricane came from that struck in 1900? We didn't have satellite pictures. We didn't have reconnaissance aircraft. And I got very lucky there. There was a guy who worked for the Hurricane Center, a guy named Jose Fernandez Partagas, Cuban immigrant to the United States who loved hurricanes, had no family, no friends. His life was hurricanes. He did his research in Miami, at Miami University. He spent a lot of time traveling the islands, reading Cuban newspapers. He had access to a NOAA database that keeps track of ships' logs throughout history. He was just absolutely addicted to hurricanes, and he produced one of the most detailed histories, one of the most detailed track records of this storm that I've ever seen, and of every historical hurricane, just about. He was the guy who did it. Now, Jose Fernandez Partagas died in 1998. He was at his favorite library, in his favorite couch, and he died in that couch, and the librarian found him there, apparently, at the end of the day. He had no friends, no family to claim his body, so the Hurricane Center claimed his body. Hurricane Center claimed his body, had him cremated, and then one day dropped his ashes through the drop port of a Hurricane Hunter aircraft into the heart of Hurricane Danielle, about 350 miles off the Florida coast. Now, if that isn't romantic, if that doesn't tell you... So that was the first challenge, and luckily, Jose Fernandez Partagas had produced this wonderful document, which was a guide to all the documents about this storm, all the old historical track records, shipping news reports, and so forth. Second challenge was to recreate the time. Now, I can't tell you how different Galveston was in 1900 than it is today. I know many of you have been to Galveston, but in 1900, Galveston was a city that was absolutely convinced that it was going to be the New York of the Gulf. And in fact, the New York newspapers were already calling it such. It was going to be a very, very big deal. It had something like 45 steamship lines serving the city. It had 26 foreign consulates. The infrastructure of the city was clearly built for a much, much larger place. It had more money than Newport, Rhode Island. It was really kind of a magical place. Even in terms of physical appearance, it literally shimmered because many of the streets were paved with oyster shells. But how do you reproduce an era in a book? And that, of course, was my goal. One of the first things that I came across was a very valuable tool in the Rosenberg Library in Galveston is a map. Now, to call it a map is to underestimate. I mean, this thing was huge. It is a leather-bound thing, about this big by this big. It's about 6 inches deep. Each page is one segment of the city. Now, this map was done by an insurance company for the fire department of Galveston. The same company did maps like this for many other cities and many even bigger cities. The point being that fire was such an awful threat in those days. What was remarkable about this map was that, first of all, it had every single house on it. You could see the house, the physical house. Not only that, you knew what the house was made of, what the house roof was made of, where the kitchen was, where the stove was, where the stable was, all this wonderful detail, which right away, well, I didn't recognize this right away, but as time went on, I realized, yeah, this is going to be a very valuable tool because it will help me literally see, like, whose house could Isaac be watching from his own house when the storm was coming? Who could see what and where? It was just a marvelous document, so that was very valuable. It also told me, like the morning of the storm in the book, I talk about Isaac Klein walking back into town against a north wind and what he was likely to be smelling. Horses, of course. I mean, I guarantee you that if we all stepped into a time machine and then stepped out of that time machine in 1900 in Galveston, the first thing we'd all do is practically retch and say, oh my God, horses. Second thing that he was smelling was he was smelling freshly planed wood. How do we know that? The map tells us that there was a wood planing mill along his route back into town. We also know that he was smelling, I believe we can know that he was smelling fresh roasted coffee because there was a bulk coffee roaster on his way into town. There were all these things on this map that told you what he was likely to be encountering on his way back into town. So that was very valuable. I also found very valuable photographs. Now that raises a question that I've been asked often. There are no photographs in my book. There's only one photograph, and that is the cover photograph of Isaac Klein. There's not even a photograph of me in the book. This was quite deliberate. It was because I wanted people who read this book to really experience the emotional power of this storm and not be constantly flipping back and forth to photographs. I can assure you that the experience of people living in Galveston after this storm was profoundly more powerful than anything a photograph could capture. For example, the burning of the bodies. Anybody who's read the book knows about that. Those who don't, for those who haven't, after the storm, body disposal was such a problem that they began burning bodies in place. And there were hundreds of pyres that simply appeared throughout Galveston and burned for days and days, where bodies, as found, were simply thrown on the fire, often without an attempt to identify them. This was such a macabre moment in the history, the emotional history of Galveston. Yet if you were to look at a photograph, you would see a pile of wood with smoke coming off the top. And I can assure you that is not what people experienced who lived there. They felt human ash sifting through the air. They smelled this. They smelled it. They felt it on their skin. And this was also an incredibly hot season, remember. So I felt that photographs, I made a decision early on that photographs would not appear in the book. However, I did use photographs. I guess I sort of compound the torment by actually referring to photographs in the book. And I described, I learned that from Murat Saad. I felt that the photographs could be a very valuable way of picking up details to essentially decorate the sets, if you will, of the book, and I found that very valuable. But I was still left with the problem of character. And of course, by this time, I had a book contract. You see, when you get a book contract for a nonfiction book, you do a book proposal first, which is essentially a very artful lie, in which you promise the world, and you sure as hell hope that the world is there. In this case, I got very lucky. The world was there, and remarkably, exactly as I had set it out in the proposal, although I didn't realize it at this point. I had a contract, I had bills to pay. My wife was particularly interested in having those bills paid. I had kids to send through school, right? But I didn't have a character, and I swore I was not going to do this book unless I had some central person, some key person that we could all kind of hold hands with and go through this storm. Now, I had come across Isaac Klein, the chief weatherman in Texas, fairly early on in my research. But I wasn't that interested in him. There was a legend in Galveston that he was kind of the Galveston Paul Revere. He had saved the day. He had raced to the beach that morning after recognizing that something awful was going to happen and saved 6,000 people. At least that's by the common legend. In his own memoir, he elevates that to 12,000. But there was something about the legend that always vaguely troubled me. I mean, here's a city that lost 8,000 people to this storm, was considered a success story by the Weather Service. And that never really quite rang absolutely true to me. But at any rate, Isaac Klein was not that interesting to me because he seemed very unidimensional. He did not seem to have that quality of emotional traction. So I kept looking. I had some other candidates, and I considered them. But then one day, as panic increasingly drove me to more and more far-flung libraries, I wound up in the NOAA Library outside Washington. It's in one of those Beltway communities. Forgive me, I can't tell you whether it's Bethesda or Silver Spring, but it's there. It's the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Library, also shared by the National Geodetic Survey. In this library, first of all, anybody who's interested in weather, geography, the history of it, go to this library. It is an amazing place. It's very distracting to go there. I found 3 things in the card catalog, but it took me 8 hours to get out of that library. I mean, here'd be one thing on the shelf, and right next to it was a box of records from some 1890s polar expedition. Handwritten records. You know, one of these things where they ate each other for dinner, you know? I mean, and here's the menu, tonight's fare, Joe, you know? I mean, it was just an amazing place. And there on one of the shelves, I came absolutely by accident across a document that I had not seen cited in any other local or not-so-local history of the Galveston hurricane. It was a 2-page document written in the Galveston News by Isaac Klein. And in it, he talks about how no tropical cyclone, and he never uses the word hurricane, it's too unscientific a term. Tropical cyclone is what he preferred. He says that no tropical cyclone could ever do serious damage to the city of Galveston. Not only that, anybody who believes otherwise was the victim, as he put it, of an absurd delusion, which is one of those moments in history where you kind of hope that there was an orchestra to play that one doom-filled chord, you know, like da-da. And right there I realized, wait a minute, this is my guy. You know, there's an old saying, show me a hero and I'll show you a tragedy. And I believe that I think Isaac Klein does represent a kind of a tragic moment in the history of that storm, certainly for himself. Now, I don't want to give away the book, but it proved certainly to be a very powerful day. Of course, then the question became, how does one find enough material about a guy who literally lost everything on the day of the storm? I mean, lost every single written possession. Well, I had no idea, but again, panic as a force in a writer's life, it drove me to even further lengths. I wound up at the National Archives in Washington, in Silver Spring, the National Archives Annex, which is another wonderful place. I mean, that's an incredible place. I don't know if anybody's been there, but it is just this gleaming chapel to the past. And if you can get past the cavity and strip search to get inside, you know, it's some of you are laughing knowingly, and you know what I mean. You can't even bring your own pencils in there. You know, they have to give you these little things that look like they were chewed off by librarians, you know, at the tip. But there, at last, Isaac Klein began to come alive for me. I never realized how powerful a figure he was in the Weather Service and how many documents there were about the guy. And that's where I really got some real insights into what he was like, what he was like as a technocrat, as a bureaucrat. Not a particularly likable side of him, I would say. But there was another side of him that emerged that I think is what really ultimately resonated with me, and that is the fact that Isaac Klein, first and foremost, even though he was a scientist, at one point a spy, lover, the works, he was above all a parent. He was the father of 3 daughters. I'm the father of 3 daughters, one of them sitting over there. His wife was pregnant at the time. My wife is not, at least not to my knowledge. And I felt a real affinity to Isaac Klein because of that, because we were both parents. There was a moment when I became absolutely hooked, and I realized that doing this book and doing it in the way that I did was inevitable. And that was the day of the storm when Isaac Klein, that afternoon, went home. He went home to his house about 5 blocks from the beach. The house was elevated above sea level about 15 feet on stilts, and the water, by the time he got home, depending on which account you want to listen to, his or his brother's, was either waist high or neck high. He goes to his house, his children are there, his wife is there, his pregnant wife. 50 other people from the neighborhood have gathered in this house as well, because they believe, hey, this is Isaac Klein's house, it's got to be good. It's got to be the place to be. So he goes home, and while he's there, he looks out his door, looks out over the city of Galveston. First of all, he sees this fantastic landscape. I mean, if you can imagine this, it's getting dark. There's a very powerful wind blowing, possibly 100, 125 miles an hour, say, at this point, but about to accelerate. He opens his door. God knows how he opened his door, but he opens his door. He's looking out. He sees, where he used to see his neighborhood, he sees open sea. This is not his neighborhood anymore. This is just water. And he doesn't see waves, however, and that's where something particularly ominous that's about to happen, but I'll leave that for anybody who wants to read the book. But he looks out and he sees open sea punctuated by rooftops, treetops, telegraph poles, and so forth. But as he's watching, something truly extraordinary occurs. This is when the bulk of the storm surge at last comes ashore. And the sea, not a wave now, the sea itself rises 4 feet in 4 seconds. If you can imagine that, 4 feet in 4 seconds, and then continues to rise. At the point when I read that, all 3 of my children were under 4 feet tall. And suddenly I realized what that truly meant for Isaac, for the city of Galveston. I mean, for many throughout the city, that was the moment between life and death, for thousands possibly, in that instant. And as a father, I kind of share the myth of competency. That is that, maybe I really can save my kids if I watch out for all those sharp edges, and if I watch out for those flip tops on the Coke cans like this morning, and the loose strands on the escalator and so forth. And so what I thought I would do is just close with a very brief, I promise you, a very brief reading, because personally I'm not a reading fan. I mean, not an oral reading fan. Very brief reading from the book. And then I thought I'd take a bunch of questions. But here's the passage that I believe is the soul of the book. And just to set it up, this passage occurs after I talk a little bit about a guy named Sam Young. Sam Young is an amateur meteorologist. He's one of the lucky fathers in Galveston that day because his family was out of town. He was a real storm junkie. At this point, he has pulled a chair up to the window of his house, pulled an armchair to the window so he can watch the storm come ashore. Even he's not absolutely convinced that this is this monster thing that he earlier had felt. So he has done that. He's sitting there and he's thinking to himself, well, this isn't so bad, and he's realizing though later that it was much worse than he thought. But here's the passage. For other fathers in homes not far from his, the afternoon was playing out in rather different fashion. Suddenly, the prospect of watching their children die became very real. Whom did you save? Did you seek to save one child, or try to save all, at the risk ultimately of saving none? Did you save a daughter or a son? The youngest or your firstborn? Did you save that sun-kissed child who gave you delight every morning? Or the benighted adolescent who made your day a torment? Save him, because every piece of you screamed to save the sweet one. And if you saved none, what then? How did you go on? On that really cheery note, I'm going to stop and take questions. And if nobody has a question, I've got a question for everybody else. Yes, sir.
They want us to stand?
Yeah, I guess they do.
In the book, you talk about the Bolivar Lighthouse.
Mm-hmm.
I listened to books on tape
Right.
and read the book, and I didn't know what happened to the lighthouse. To the
Oh,
people in
yeah.
the lighthouse.
Yeah, he's asking about the Bolivar Lighthouse, and what I've found is, I just assumed everybody would realize that everybody in that lighthouse survived. But people have often asked me, you know, after a talk, they say, okay, but now tell me, what happened to all those people in the light? I said, oh, well, they're fine. I mean, they were fine. They're all dead now, but they were they were fine after that. But thank you for asking that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I have not read your book, but of course I will this
Okay,
week.
next question.
And my understanding is that Isaac Klein was a bit of a hero before you wrote your book.
He's still a hero.
Okay, all right. I mean, I'm wondering what the reception has been since you've exposed his foibles, so to speak.
Well, that's
in
why
Galveston
police
and
are
Texan
here.
and-
No.
You know, you live in Seattle, is that right?
I live in Seattle.
Yeah, I'm from Seattle.
Are
And
you?
I didn't hear
All right.
about the Galveston storm till I moved to Texas.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing. She's asking, Ceci, what was the response in Galveston? You know, especially since Isaac Klein had been, is and had been certainly considered this clearly a hero. And my book does not. I mean, you should read the book because you're playing back some of the press stuff, and even though I'm a member of the media, I mean, some of the press stories kind of distorted it and made him. One actually called him a villain, and that's not it. All I'm saying is that the legend of Isaac Klein deserves some and needs some qualification, and I so qualify it because there's enough evidence that kind of rebuts the legend, and that you would have to deny it and ignore it in order to accept the legend. What I found in Galveston, I was a little perturbed by two things before I went down. We launched the book in Galveston on September 8th. I was a little perturbed before I went down there and thought about buying a bulletproof vest. But I was a little perturbed because two things happened. One, I heard from a bookstore owner who said, you might be surprised at the reaction down here. And I'm like, oh, how do you mean? She said, you'll see. And the other was, literally on the same day, I got an email from someone in Texas who called me an arrogant, snotty carpetbagger. So I thought, I'd send him a thank you, and I thought, okay. It was one of those times when you really hope there's a weather cancellation of your flight, But I got down to Galveston, and much to my delight, I found the warmest reception. And I found a lot of people who were hoping that the book would do for Galveston what Midnight in the Garden of Eden did for Savannah. Now, I find that a little bit odd because this is a storm that virtually wiped out the city and really damaged the future of Galveston. But I can understand it. And in fact, there's a certain amount of publicity that is accruing now, positive stuff toward Galveston. For example, just in the New York Times travel section last weekend, I believe, there was a big piece about Galveston. So anyway, the reception was startlingly good. In fact, so good that I kind of wish my whole tour had just stayed in Galveston instead of going anywhere else. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I guess I'm asking you to rewrite history, but given what do you speculate the time frame they would have had if they had paid attention to the possible warnings that they could have gotten?
Could have had, depending on where things. I mean, one thing I have to emphasize: it's not strictly Isaac Klein's failure to understand what was going on. There was a sequence of really kind of interesting bureaucratic things, especially what happened in Cuba. That, to me, was the most fascinating. And again, I'm not going to give that away, but it was really, really interesting to me, at least. Depending on where things, if things hadn't broken down in Cuba, there would have been substantial warning. Then the question would have been, well, what would Galveston do about it? And, at the minimum, see, one of the things that happened that day was that a lot of people, as was the custom, came to town for the weekend or for the day to visit relatives, to enjoy the sea, and so forth. And they came by trains. When train travel was incredibly fluid, there were countless trains coming and going. And, travelers, visitors, tourists came by the droves that morning. They weren't aware that this was going to happen. So it's likely, unless they're like Sam Young or frankly like me, it's likely that they would have stayed away and not taken the train that day and put off the visit to Grandma until the next weekend. That's likely. But as to, and it seems to me also likely that with 48 hours notice, which is conceivably what could have happened, that more people would have gone to the center of town. Certainly hurricane flags would have been up in Galveston. Instead, there was simply a routine storm flag. So it's interesting to debate. I stay away from that in the book because I can't place contemporary thinking about evacuation in that era. It's just interesting to speculate on. Very interesting, as a matter of fact. Yes, sir.
Yes, as a native Texan, I'd like to welcome you to Texas and commend you on what is or will soon be a bestseller, I'm sure.
It is now, but thank you.
Yes, sir. As a novelist myself, I'm curious about your game plan. When you began to plan this book, did you come to Texas? Did you stay in Galveston? Did you go up in the American National Insurance Building and look at the island and just really get the feel of it?
Yeah, I came to Galveston many times, spent a lot of time at the Rosenberg Library, spent a lot of time kind of roaming around the East Beach and West Beach area. What I found interesting is that, I had expected there to be more of the old Galveston, even in tatters, but more of the old Galveston than there is. I mean, that's a city that underwent some fairly severe urban problems in the 60s and 70s and is now, I think, really getting its act together in some remarkable ways. I mean, thanks to, I think, George Mitchell in particular with his hotels and his developments and so forth. I mean, it's quite amazing and really parts of the city now are really very vibrant, very, very cool. But what I found instantly was that so much had changed since the storm. One of the reasons being that after the storm there was a seawall that was built. After the storm, of course. I mean, everybody kind of regrets that. But even, the fact is the seawall probably wouldn't do any good anyway against a Category 4 or 5 hurricane. In fact, Weather Service people are kind of concerned about that seawall because they think it's going to make people stay in Galveston when they shouldn't. One of the things that I found is that seawall has seawall and what happened also, after they built the seawall, which is 17 or 18 feet at the coastline, at the shoreline, and recedes to about 4 or 5 feet, I guess, at the wharf. What happened was the seawall doesn't recede, but what happened is they raised the whole city so that the water wouldn't simply flow in behind the seawall. And if you can imagine this, I mean, they raised entire cathedrals with hand jacks, thousands of hand jacks up high and then filled in underneath. I mean, they raised the whole town. There are places in Galveston still where you will find, like, say, about a 3-foot fence that used to be a 10-foot fence because they simply filled, and there's the fence. I mean, that's one of those fences that will not go anywhere. They did shorten the gate, however. This is an important step. But what you find what I found is that something really fundamental had changed that in a way frustrated me, but also liberated me, and that was perspective. Perspective had changed completely. There was no way now to go to Galveston and stand in front of the place where Isaac Klein once had his office and get a sense of what he could see that day from the front of his, from the sidewalk in front of his office, or even from upstairs, because the perspective is completely different. You can still get that perspective. I mean, what I mean is the sense of how flat and vulnerable Galveston really was. You can still get that in the East Beach and the West Beach, but that was so fundamental. And also, just the distortion of these kind of big hotels like the Holiday Inn and the San Luis Resort and so forth. I expected something more like Charleston, and didn't get it. And so in a way I was freer to imagine what it would have been like back in 1900 by reconstructing from photographs, from the map and so forth. That was a very satisfying part of the whole thing, actually, was trying to rebuild in my mind, and hopefully in readers' minds, a city that once existed and no longer does. So I hope that's a long-winded answer, but thanks for your question. Yes?
Several years ago.
Gary Cartwright's The Big Blow?
Okay.
Yeah.
And they mentioned a man who was part of the weather team who goes home for lunch and he looks at the barometer and it's fallen to 12 and he thinks there's something wrong with the barometer and he says, when I come back, I'll check it. Well, of course, he never gets back. Would this was not Isaac Klein, you don't think? Or was that fiction?
Not something I came across. I don't know if it was fiction. It might even have been a different article than the one I'm thinking.
You're right. I think it was Cartwright. Sorry.
I don't remember that in Cartwright's piece, but I don't know. I mean, it was a while since I read it. I liked his piece very much,
okay.
Especially if he's in here. Yes, sir.
Did you go into the legal and practical aspects of the long-time recovery? For example, several square miles, the housing, the lots, the ownership, the deeds, everything had been destroyed, no heirs. Did you go into any of that in your research?
I did not. there's only, you know, one of the things that I also set out early on in terms of a game plan again is you know, you have a certain structure, and a hurricane, when you think about it, has a natural narrative structure. It begins far off, and, you know, with the gathering of forces, kind of like a Larry McMurtry novel, you know, where all these guys kind of ride into town, hook up, do things, and then get shot one by one, you know, that kind of thing. I love you, Larry McMurtry, if you're here. But one of the things I felt early on was that, that you know, a hurricane, the natural narrative structure builds to a perfect climax. And then, again, my own preference is, once you get to the climax, just get me out of the book. You know, just let me go. And so I wanted to make sure that the aftermath and the denouement, it was just handled as quickly as I could, so I couldn't consider everything. I just wanted to really focus, again, on the emotional life of this hurricane. But I'm sure the legal tangles afterwards were just must have been incredible. And they probably persist today, I don't know. But it was, I did not get into that. Yeah. Yes?
As someone who grew up in Galveston and learned to love books at the Rosenberg Library, and heard my grandmother tell of surviving the storm in an undertaker's parlor on, I think it was on Broadway. I was wondering if I went to the Rosenberg Library, could I access that map and perhaps locate the undertaker's parlor?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the map is right out there. In fact, it's one of the more accessible things in that library, and I'm sure Anna or Casey would be delighted to do it. I mean, there too, you have to sign in, and you know, you might have to put on a pair of gloves, but yeah, they'd be delighted to help you, and you would find this. You definitely would. Yeah. Which was it? Was it Levy? Was it Levy Brothers?
Well, I know there's Levy Brothers there now.
Right. Well, there was then also. I mean, that was the big.
It probably was then. Either that or Malloy.
Yeah, but it'll be there. Believe me, on that map, that's the thing to check. Yeah. Yes, sir. Back there.
Well, surely when you tackle this subject, there have been books written about this.
Right.
Did you just feel like there hadn't been a definitive book, or was it you were going to approach it with the emotional aspect?
Well, I felt there had been books. The best, I think, being A Weekend in September by Weems. And in fact, in 1900 alone, between September and the end of December, there were 6 books published and distributed, each about 300 or 400 pages long, if you can believe it, in that era. I mean, it was an amazing time. But again, the question of emotional traction was there. I mean, I really wanted to explore the narrative power of this, and also to look at the time. I mean, frankly, I wasn't so interested in looking at, I mean, the hurricane is infinitely compelling, but I really wanted this book to be more of a window on an era and on an attitude, and that's really what it is. It's an attitude and the dangers of that attitude. And if you really want to stretch, I mean, the point was to kind of metaphorically look at the birth of the 20th century, which became ultimately a very dark century, at least for the first 50 years. I don't know if that was accomplished, but I also found, though, as I went along, that there's a lot of stuff that I have in my book that is absolutely brand new. The stuff from the archives, the Cuba stuff, a lot of the letters I found in the archives, a lot of the stuff about Isaac Klein, the article about by Isaac Klein, all brand new. And I think it really advanced the ball in the historiography of the storm. And also the Partagas, Jose Fernandez Partagas track. I mean, I think that's all new stuff too. At least I have not seen that read anywhere. So I think it added to the party. It also made a more compelling story. My daughter has a question. Wait, you got to wait for this guy to come here with the microphone. Stand up.
When I was reading the book, you said that everything was true.
Yes.
And how did you know that exactly what they said?
Thank you, Mike Wallace, for that. Next question. No, it's a terrific question, and I did not actually plant that question. I'm very impressed. I'm very impressed. I don't know how you're getting home today, but I'm taking a plane out of here. No, she's talking about anything that's in quotes in the book was actually in a document of some kind. It was either in a letter. In one case, you'll see there was a stretch of dialogue in the Cuban section. That is actual dialogue from a Cuban newspaper where they simply ran out the entire interview because they were so astonished at how absurd it was to be interviewing this head of the signal service in Cuba. It's an astonishing interview, and actually the whole thing is even more astonishing, but I can only put a little bit in there. One convention that I did do early on was I decided to use the word said, instead of like he wrote or he put in a letter or something, and rely on very extensive documentation in the back of the book for anybody who wanted to find out where things came from. And I urge anybody who reads the book to read through the back, because there are stories in there. I always put stories in the notes for people who take the effort to read the notes, because it could be very rewarding. I really enjoy that part of the book. It's like you're done with the tough part, now let's have some fun with the extras, you know. But anyway, that's everything is absolutely true in this book. There were no Edmund Morris isms in it. Although let me also say that I have not read Edmund Morris's book, and I have to, because of that, and nor will I. I don't have much interest in Ronald Reagan. I'm very interested in this recently pulled George W. Bush biography, the one that was written by the crooks. But, but I'm interested in how that came to be, boy, I'll tell you. About the Edmund Morris book, I have to say that I share the view of Jonathan Yardley, who is a book reviewer for the Washington Post, and he said when asked about the book, he said, I haven't read it, and I think he also said he wouldn't read it, but he said, because I have not read it, I have to essentially quote the advice that Southern mothers have given to their children for centuries, which is, shut your mouth. Yes, sir. This gentleman over here. Wait 2 seconds. And
you haven't touched yet on the small war going on between the two brothers, Isaac and his brother.
Yeah, small war. Have you read the book?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Uh-oh. Yeah, I talk about the rivalry between Isaac Klein and his brother Joseph. And it's interesting. I kind of picked up on that to begin with in the National Archives. There is a very interesting document there written by Joseph in the 1920s. Now, these guys shared a very intimate experience during the storm. In this document in the National Archives, it's a 5-page, single-spaced typed account of the storm done for a history that the Weather Bureau was putting together. In this document, there is, Joseph makes incredible effort never to mention Isaac Klein, never. And it's like the old Monty Python shows, you know, how like, in particular, if anybody remembers the old parrot routine, you know, when he's trying to explain that the parrot is dead, meaning it's no longer living, you know, it's no longer with us, it's no blah, blah, blah. You remember this, right? You remember the parrot routine. And he made such an effort not to talk about Joseph. I mean, to the point where it was comical, or it would be if it wasn't so sad. So I explored that a little bit more, read the memoirs very, very closely, kind of held them up one against the other. When you read them over and over, which is a very painful experience because neither guy was a very good writer, but when you hold them close to each other, and you read them word for word, line for line, and you see where they differ, it's a very powerful thing. But also, it turns out that at least from what I was able to learn from reporting, is that within the Weather Service, it was and is still common knowledge that those guys were rivals. Neil Frank told me as much down in Galveston, and I was very impressed by that. So I thought, yeah, that rings true. Yes, ma'am. I mean, no, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. I couldn't see you. Yes.
I have the pleasure of using your book as reading material in a Texas Coastal Management law class that I teach, and I thank you for publishing it just in time for the class. But what I wanted to point out to you is that one of the values of your book that you may not realize is that you could save 12,000 lives very easily if you persuade enough people in coastal cities in the United States to pay some attention to the weather service they have now and to the warnings they get. But I'm here to tell you that's not true at this time. Most people, although you hear about the evacuations and you hear about all the mass exodus from the coast when a hurricane comes, the truth is there are tens of thousands of people who still stay there. And as soon as your book becomes required reading in Galveston, why, a few lives might be saved someday.
Well, amen to that, I'll tell you. We probably have time for one more question, or? Oh, my daughter's telling me that this is the cutoff. Yeah, she's supposed to say Dad at 12:45. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming. Thank you.
Sure. Why was Isaac Klein sent to far west Texas? Was he in some bad state? I mean, that was the end of the world.
That was considered a good posting.
It was? Okay.
Yeah, because he was like head of the Texas section. And, yeah, he was considered a good pick.
Did you, in your research, did you find anything? Oh my mind, I've heard of Memphis when you guys heard about the blacks that were used on the largest.
Eric Larson's book, Isaac's Storm, was published in September by Crown Publishers. It's at number 13 on the New York Times bestsellers list this week. An audio version of the book is also available from Random House Audio on cassette and compact disc. You're looking at some of the approximately 20,000 fairgoers who attended this year's